We're now going to talk about the impacts on some of the different natural cycles that we have in apes. So far, we have talked about the carbon cycle. We've talked about the nitrogen cycle. We've talked about the phosphorus cycle. And we've also talked about the water cycle. All of these are extremely important processes that happen in the environment that allow us to move nutrients and atoms. So let's talk about how humans, unfortunately, disrupt this. As we all know, humans are going to make alterations to their environment, and then these changes are going to lead to the unintended consequences. So, like I mentioned before, we're going to focus on these four here today. Let's start with the hydrological, or AKA the water cycle. And we're going to focus a lot on deforestation. So, when we tear down forests, what's happening is we're removing these roots from the soil. And when we do that, we're going to get less infiltration. And because when the water runs down, the roots help it to move down and infiltrate through the soil. So if we get rid of those roots, all of a sudden we're going to have less of this infiltration. Therefore, we're not going to be able to fill up our aquifers, where all that water moves into the groundwater. Also, because of the lack of roots, we're going to have a lot more runoff, and that runoff is going to take a lot of soil with it. So it's causing a lot of erosion and a lot of flooding. And without the plants, we're going to have less transpiration. If you remember, transpiration is when the water exits out the leaves as H2O and it's added into the atmosphere. So with less H2O in the atmosphere, we're going to have less precipitation overall. And with a steeper terrain, we're going to have a greater impact of that deforestation because of the increased amount of flooding and the decreased amount of infiltration happening. Now, in cities where we have urbanization, we're going to create a very impervious surface. That means that water cannot go through it, just like cement. Water cannot trickle down through cement, so it's not going to enter into our soil as easily. We're going to get less infiltration and therefore more runoff and more flooding. Because we have no trees, because we replace these trees by cement and by buildings, we're going to have less transpiration as well, so therefore less precipitation. Now let's talk about the carbon cycle. With the carbon cycle, as big theme here is burning fossil fuels. When we burn them for power and for transportation, we're going to have increased CO2 in the atmosphere. And because of deforestation, we're going to have less CO2 that is removed, less plants available to remove that CO2 from the atmosphere because of photosynthesis. So more CO2 going into the atmosphere and less CO2 coming out of the atmosphere. Now let's look at the nitrogen cycle. So some of our agricultural practices, such as pesticides, irrigation, tilling, all of these, what they're going to do is they're going to disperse this soil bacteria. And this bacteria is what's going to fix the nitrogen, if you remember. So by having all of that dispersed, it leads to less nitrogen that is then available for our plants. We're also using a lot of chemical fertilizers. And when we use these fertilizers, we're putting excess nitrogen into our aquatic ecosystems, which is not where we want it. So we have to figure out ways to transfer that back into our soil so it's available for our plants. If you're a farmer, every year you're going to destroy your crops. All right, so we're going to do an annual removal of the plant matter from our crop. And when we take away that plant matter, that means there's nothing available to be decomposed so we can return that nitrogen back into the soil. So another issue. And then finally, deforestation. When we take a forest and we cut it down to create growing land instead, we're going to get a lot more runoff, which will erode the soil, and it's going to carry that nitrogen compounds with it. When the soil moves, so do those nitrogen compounds. And finally, let's look at the phosphorus cycle. Very similar to the nitrogen cycle. Deforestation is going to create an increased runoff, which is again going to erode the soil. And as I mentioned, just with the nitrogen, it's also going to carry away those important phosphorus compounds that the plants need. Then we're also using these high phosphate fertilizers, and we call these things these detergents, kind of like a soap. And when we do that, it's going to increase the levels of phosphorus in the aquatic ecosystems. Again, not where we want it. We need the phosphorus in our soil, not in our water. So it's moving our atoms into a place where we don't want it to be, making it much more difficult to get it back into our soil again. All right, that's a wrap. You know we're going to go into more detail about this. Enjoy your day.